We certainly know, and I think it's important to say this now, that we know that many children on the spectrum, many adults on the spectrum suffer and they struggle. And I am not in any way going to suggest that autism is a gift. But it is more than what we think it is, and that's the point I really want to emphasize. So what helped us move in this direction was this concept of neurodiversity. This was developed the first time written by a sociologist, Judy Singer, who herself was on the autism spectrum, and she invented this term to describe conditions like autism, dyslexia, ADHD, because she wanted to shift the focus from a discourse on only deficits and atypical ways of thinking and learning and behaving to one that is more reflective of other kinds of diversities, biodiversity, cultural diversity, and so on. So neurodiversity has become a real interesting term. So based on that notion, the profile of what we are understanding about persons, individuals with ASD is really quite different and beyond the narrow categories of DSM-5. So it doesn't account, DSM-5 does not account for the ongoing brain research. There's no clear focus on etiology or core and derivative concerns. And in that regard, it's neutral. They just describe behaviors, but often those behaviors as describing can lead to reifying. So if you have a label that describes a cluster, people think they've explained it by naming it. And I think that's something we must challenge. And there really isn't much consideration from a multidisciplinary perspective. So neurodiversity takes a step in the direction of trying to really recognize that there are a wide range of abilities and capacities and strengths that exist in individuals with ASD, and it's not just a pathogenic interest, just a pathological or deficit-based model. It forces us to recognize the enormous influence, by the way, of the social context. You know, I'm going to mention his name later. Richard Grinker is an anthropologist who's written extensively, and I have a reference to him later. Has studied the existence of disability ideas and autism specifically in many different countries and cultures, and he has really argued so persuasively that it differs from country to country. What is seen as a disability in one culture may not be viewed as a disability in another culture, so we have to really think about that. I also think neurodiversity forces us to consider issues of social justice. We have a responsibility, especially if the othering happens, this notion. You know, for many years, special education was regarded as a remedial education for those who have special needs. But in so many ways, the view is special education is just education. Just meaning merely education, it's merely education, but it's also about social justice. It's having each child, and by the way, I didn't come up with that saying, I wish I did. I've seen it on posters in our department, but I love it. But it's really about what does the child need? So social justice, and by the way, I didn't get into this, but there are racial disparities in identifying children with ASD. African American children in our country tend to be diagnosed fewer times. They're more likely to be given a behavioral problem than a developmental problem. And there are implicit social injustices that I think that reflects. I also think neurodiversity means our goal is not to make someone behave in the way we want them to behave. Many times, by the way, some of the literature talks about normalizing behavior. You know, and I don't know what that means, to be normal, right? I had this provocative conversation before, I think with you, Brian, that, and I probably shouldn't say this, but now that I've started, I will, that for many years, I would really feel like the goal of changing behavior was to make children do human things, to make them sit down, to look in your eye, to do things. But it wasn't necessarily about helping to develop fully human beings. It was about the manifestation. And so this focus on compliance, I think, has really been an injustice, I think, and a sameness for all. And so it's a call for inclusion, and among the self-advocates, there's a saying, and this is an old saying, by the way, in the disability field, nothing about us without us. And by the way, if you look at the DSM, Every other diagnosis, including depression and anxiety, talks about the patient's report, but not in autism. Autism is described by everybody else. All right? Paula Kluth, all of you know Paula Kluth, a wonderful author who wrote this wonderful handbook for teachers called You're Gonna Love This Kid, that's about inclusion with autism. She really talks so much about this notion of whose perspective is reflected in DSM.